Wyoming Territory, July 1883. The air was dry, the sun already blistering by mid-morning, and inside the weather-beaten stable behind the Laramie Creek Inn, a young woman knelt in the straw, picking at a crust of bread left near the mule's trough. Tessaria Abbott was 21, barefoot, and thinner than she used to be. Her once sturdy skirts hung loose around her waist, her blouse torn at the shoulder. The innkeeper's wife, a bitter woman with a fondness for gin and cruelty, had shoved her out of the kitchen weeks ago. Said if she wanted to keep sleeping in the hayloft, she'd have to earn it by cleaning stalls and making herself scarce. Tess had nowhere else to go. No money. No kin. Her father had died of fever 2 winters ago. Her stepmother sold the house, took the money, and vanished. Tess had come west hoping to find work as a seamstress. What she found was silence, closed doors, and eventually the stable. She was not allowed inside the inn anymore. Not for warmth, not for food. So she waited until dusk when scraps were thrown out, and if the dogs didn't get to them first, she did. Her hands trembled as she lifted the crust to her mouth. "Ma'am," the voice hit her like a gust of wind. She dropped the bread and scrambled back, her heart thudding. A man stood in the open stable door, tall and broad-shouldered, the sun behind him turning his outline gold. He wore a trailcoat dusted from the ride and had eyes the color of dark clay. His hat sat low, shadowing a square jaw and a mouth set in quiet concern. He stepped inside, slow and careful. "I did not mean to startle you." Tess said nothing. Her stomach twisted, half in hunger, half in fear. "I came for my horse." He gestured to the stall behind her. "But that is not why I stayed." He looked at her. Not like the men who passed through the inn, who stared too long and waited for her to look back. He looked at her like she was a person, like he was trying to understand what in God's name had happened to her. She rose slowly, brushing hay from her skirt. "I will be gone in a minute. You do not need to leave." He glanced at the crust on the ground, then back to her face. "That how you eat?" She lifted her chin. "It is none of your concern." He took a step forward. "It is now." She blinked. "My name is Rylan Carter," he said. "I am headed north, but I am not walking away after seeing this." Tess tightened her jaw. "And what exactly did you see?" "A woman starving, sleeping in filth, treated like she is worth less than the mule." His voice was steady, but his hands were curled into fists. "I am not looking for charity," she said. "I am not offering any." He paused. "I am offering my name." She stared at him. He said it again, quieter this time. "You can come with me. I will get you fed safe. No one touches you. You will be my wife." Her breath caught. "I do not expect anything from you," he added. "But if you say yes, I will take you out of here today. You do not even know me." "I know enough." Tess looked down at her hands, at the dirt under her nails, the bones showing under her skin. She had not heard her name said kindly in months. She had not eaten a proper meal in longer. And this man, this stranger, was offering her his name like it was a cloak against the storm. She swallowed hard. "Why?" His eyes softened. "Because no one should be forced to eat scraps in a stable." The words fell between them like a stone dropped in still water. Tess's voice was barely above a whisper. "You would call me your wife," he nodded. "I already did." Something in her chest cracked and heat rushed to her eyes. She did not cry. She did not know if she could anymore. But she nodded. He held out his hand. She took it. By nightfall, they were 20 miles outside Laramie. Rylan had a wagon pulled by 2 sturdy bays with supplies enough for a week. A wide canvas tarp covered the back, and inside was a blanket roll, a tin of beans and dried apples. Tess sat on the wagon bench beside him, wrapped in a spare coat he had given her. It smelled of leather and firewood. She kept her hands tucked in the sleeves. He gave her space. "Ask no questions. Just drove when they camped. He built the fire and handed her a plate of beans and bread. Real bread, warm and soft. She ate slow, her eyes never leaving the flames. "You have people?" he asked once, voice low. "No," she said. He nodded like that was all he needed to know. They slept apart. He took the ground by the fire. She curled in the wagon bed, but in the morning when he handed her a tin cup of coffee, she met his eyes and said, "Thank you, Rylan." His name on her tongue made something shift in his chest. He did not say anything, just tipped his hat and packed up camp. They reached a quiet stretch south of Buffalo after 5 days. There was a cabin there, tucked in a bend of the Powder River. It had a porch, a stove, and a single bedroom with a bed big enough for 2. "I built it last spring," he said, leading the horses to the lean-to. "Had plans to stay here through the winter." Tess stood in the doorway, the wood floor warm under her bare feet. "You live alone?" "I did." She turned to look at him. He met her eyes. "Not anymore," she smiled. Small but real. The first week passed in quiet tasks. She swept the floor, washed the windows, peeled potatoes. He chopped wood, hunted, fixed the broken shutter. They moved around each other like two people learning a new language, careful, gentle. But on the 8th night, as rain whispered against the roof and wind pushed through the trees, Tess stood behind him while he read a letter by lamplight. "Rylan," he looked up. She stepped closer. "You do not expect anything from me. You said that, but I want to give it." He stood, unsure. She reached for his hand. "You saved me, not just from that place, from disappearing." His voice caught. "Tess, I want to be your wife," she said, "not just in name." He touched her cheek, his thumb brushing her skin like she might vanish. "Are you sure?" "I am." He kissed her, soft, steady, like he had been waiting all his life for her to say yes. And when they lay down that night, it was not out of obligation or rescue. It was because they had already begun to fall in love, quietly, deeply, without needing to say it. But now, Tess said it anyway, her lips against his shoulder in the dark. "I love you, Rylan." His arms tightened around her. "I love you too, Tessaria." The wind carried the smell of pine and damp earth as July softened into August. Mornings came cool, touched with the promise of autumn, and Tess began rising before the sun, brushing her fingers through the dew-laced grass before bringing in water from the creek. The cabin had no well, only a short footpath winding down to the edge of the river, where the water ran shallow and cold over smooth stones. Rylan was already outside most mornings, tending the fence along the north pasture. He worked with quiet focus, sleeves rolled to the elbow, lines of sweat darkening the back of his shirt. Tess watched him sometimes through the window, her hand still in the basin, a bowl half rinsed beneath the soap. They hardly spoke while working. But come evening, when the fire crackled low and dinner had settled warm in their bellies, their words found shape in the hush between chores. "Did you ever think about leaving Wyoming?" Tess asked one night, her knees drawn up to the edge of the rocking chair. Her voice, always soft, had grown steadier these past weeks. Rylan leaned back on the porch rail, the last light of the day catching in the curve of his jaw. "Once, before I finished the cabin, thought maybe I'd go east, try rail work, but I can't stand the crowds, or the noise." She ran her thumb along the grain of the wood armrest. "I thought of Chicago once. I had a cousin there. She sent a letter when I turned 16, said I could stay with her if I ever made it out, but I never answered." "You regret that?" "No," she said. "But I wonder if she ever wondered why I didn't come." Rylan didn't offer a comfort. He just looked out toward the tree line where the sky bled lavender and gold. "I think people leave spaces open for those they love, even if they never fill them." Tess closed her eyes. The breeze lifted strands of her hair and tangled them around her cheek. She let it stay. That night, When they lay curled under the quilt Tess had patched with scraps of old cotton, she slid her hand beneath his and whispered, "You don't ask much about before." "I figure you'll tell it when you're ready," he said. "I had a little sister," she said quietly. Her name was Ruthie. His thumb traced the inside of her wrist, slow and sure. "She died when I was 12. Fever took her in 2 days. After that, my father never sang again. He used to sing while he worked, but he just stopped." Rylan didn't interrupt. "Sometimes I hear his voice in my dreams," she said, "but it's never singing. Just calling my name like he used to when supper was ready." She pressed her face into his chest, and he held her until her breathing softened. In the days that followed, Tess started humming while she swept. Not anything familiar, just low, tuneless murmurs that matched the motion of her hands. Rylan never said a word about it, but one afternoon, as he passed through the doorway with an armful of kindling, he paused and tipped his head like he was memorizing the sound. They began adding to the cabin. Not for necessity, but because the work felt good. Rylan framed out a small room off the back, meant for storage, but Tess brought in chipped blue china from a peddler's cart in town and lined them along the shelf like they belonged in something finer. "You think of children?" she asked one night as the stars settled deeper into the sky. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up her hand, turning it over in his. "Only if you do." "I think I'd like to," she said. "When we're ready." Her hand stayed in his. On a Sunday in late August, they rode into Buffalo for supplies. Tess wore a dress she'd altered from an old flannel, buttons cleaned, hem stitched neat. She walked beside Rylan through the dry, packed street with her shoulders upright, eyes ahead. She didn't flinch when someone looked too long. At the mercantile, a woman behind the counter handed over a spool of thread and said, "Your husband's quiet." Tess smiled. "He says what matters." The woman tipped her head. "Sometimes that's the best kind." Later, as they loaded flour and salt into the wagon, Rylan said, "You looked them in the eye." She glanced at him. They looked back. He brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're stronger than you know." "I'm starting to believe that." That night, as the wagon rolled back through the hills and the sky stretched wide above them, Tess leaned against his arm and let the quiet hold them both. She didn't need to ask where they were going anymore. She already knew. September brought the first frost. It settled silver across the grass each morning and lingered on the cabin roof until the sun dragged it off in slow drips. The air turned sharp, and the work changed with it. Rylan mended the last of the gaps in the roofline. Tess tacked thick muslin over the window frames to hold off the coming cold. They moved in rhythm now, meals, repairs, the quiet hours between all without needing to speak much. But when they did, it was with a kind of closeness that had deepened like creek water after a long rain. One afternoon, Rylan carried in a bundle of rabbit hides and laid them on the table. "These'll make good lining," he said, brushing the dust from his sleeves. Tess turned from the hearth, where she'd been stirring a pot of stewed squash. "You trap all these today?" "Some yesterday." "Left the rest curing under pine ash." She ran her fingers over the fur, soft and still warm from the sun. "I could sew them into mitts, maybe a collar for your coat." He nodded, then hesitated. "You ever sew for someone else? Before here?" She looked up from the hides. "I used to take in mending for the neighbors. Nothing fancy. But I liked the way it felt fixing something with my hands, like it gave me back a piece of myself." Rylan watched her a moment, then pulled a folded square of muslin from his coat pocket. "There's a trader in town. Said he'd pay for hand-stitched shirts if I brought him a sample." Tess unfolded the cloth carefully. "You want to sell my work?" "Only if you want to, but you've got the skill. Could be yours, not just something you do for us." She held the muslin to the light, silent. Rylan leaned his hip against the table. You ever think about what you'd build here if it were just up to you? Tess set the square down and wiped her hands on her apron. I think I'd make a garden, not just onions and beans, real herbs, maybe lavender. Something that smells good when the wind comes through, he smiled. Then we'll start clearing space come spring. That night, Tess laid the muslin across her lap and stitched by lamplight. Rylan took a book from the shelf, though he didn't read so much as glance up at her now and again, as if the sight of her working settled something in him. Later, she folded the shirt front and set it on the table. You think he'll like it? He'll want 10 more. A week passed, the sun dipping lower each day. On a Sunday, they climbed the ridge behind the cabin. Rylan carried a rifle slung across his back, but he wasn't hunting. He moved slow, pointing out tracks Tess hadn't noticed: elk, fox, a single bear print half pressed into the mud. They reached the top by late afternoon. The valley stretched wide below them, the river carving its winding line through the low brush, cottonwoods already turning yellow. Tess pulled her shawl tighter. I didn't know it looked like this from up here. This is where I came when I was thinking about building, Rylan said. Figured if I could see the land like this, I could trust it to hold me. She sat on a flat rock warmed by the sun. And now, he crouched beside her, resting his forearms on his knees. Now I trust it to hold us. She looked at him, then really looked. There was dirt under his nails, a scar at the edge of his brow she hadn't noticed before. His skin had darkened from the sun, and his hair had grown long enough to curl beneath his hat. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a man who'd chosen her every day since that first one. I think I could be happy here, she said. He reached for her hand, his fingers rough and warm. You already make it home. They didn't rush back down. The light stretched long and the wind moved slow through the grass. When they finally descended, the moon had risen and their path glowed pale beneath their feet. That night, Tess didn't sleep right away. She lay awake, listening to Rylan breathe beside her, steady and close. I want to plant early peas come spring, she whispered into the dark, and maybe keep chickens if we can build a coop. She felt him shift, his arm sliding around her waist. We'll build it together. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and inside the quiet wrapped around them, whole and sure. Neither of them said the word future. They didn't need to. It was already unfolding, day by steady day, stitched together like the seams of a well-made shirt. By mid-October, the elk began moving lower through the pines. Rylan followed their patterns, tracking along the ridgelines at dawn, returning by dusk with his coat damp from snowmelt and the weight of distance in his steps. Tess had taken to keeping a kettle on the stove and a second quilt folded at the foot of their bed. He never asked her to. She never said she did. One evening, after he'd returned with a buck dressed and hanging from the lean-to, he sat at the table while Tess set down bowls of boiled barley and turnips. His eyes were rimmed with weariness, the wind having stripped color from his cheeks. He didn't eat right away. There's a man come through from Sheridan, he said, watching the steam rise from his bowl. Stopped me out near the foothills, said there's talk of new grazing laws, might mean fences have to come down. Tess leaned her elbows on the table. You'd have to pull ours, could be. If the land's claimed as open range come spring. She chewed her lip. Would they give you another plot? No guarantees. Depends who's got paperwork. Some don't care who's lived where, just what's signed. Tess traced a line in the wood grain with her fingertip. What would you do if you had to leave? He looked at her then, long enough she felt it settle behind her ribs. I wouldn't go far, not without you, not without a place to start again. She held his gaze. We'd take the loom and the tools, and the blue china, he nodded, and your garden soil. Sack it up if we had to. They ate in quiet after that, though it was not a silence born of fear. More the kind that comes when two people begin preparing for change not as a threat, but as a turning. The next morning, Tess found a scattering of feathers beside the henhouse. The door stood open, latch broken. She crouched, lifting one of the feathers still warm at the stem. "Fox?" she asked when Rylan came behind her, rifle slung low. "Likely," he said. "Tracks are fresh. Took two of the reds." She straightened. "We'll need a heavier latch." "And wire." "I'll ride into town, ask after a trapper, maybe get a dog trained for guarding." She nodded. "And I'll sew a sack for feed. We'll need to keep it hung high." He watched her a moment. "You're getting good at thinking ahead." "I've had to learn." That afternoon, she took scraps of cloth and began piecing them into a new quilt, not from necessity, but for the small joy of building something meant only for warmth. Rylan returned the next day with wire, a coil of rope, and a young dog with pale fur and a bent ear. He didn't say where he'd gotten it, just knelt beside it in the grass and said, "She's called Juniper." Tess crouched nearby and held out her hand. The dog sniffed, then leaned into her touch. "She's soft," Tess said. "She's yours," Rylan told her. "She took to your scent before mine." Juniper slept at the foot of their bed that night, curled tight as a fern. When the wind howled down from the hills, she didn't stir. Later, as Rylan banked the stove for the night, Tess folded the new quilt and laid it near the hearth. "I was thinking," she said, not quite looking at him, "if the grazing laws change and we do have to move, I'd want to go somewhere with open sky still. But maybe near enough a school." He raised a brow. "You wanting to teach?" She shook her head. "I'd want our children to have one." He crossed the room and took her hands, the fire casting them both in gold. "Then when the time comes, we'll find land near a town. Close enough for them to walk to a bell. Far enough to still hear the wind." Her throat caught, but she didn't cry. She had learned to feel joy without needing to break under it. Outside, the dog shifted in her sleep, and the trees bent low, heavy with the weight of a coming season. Inside, Tess and Rylan stood still, hands joined, the fire between them throwing slow-moving shadows along the cabin walls. They had no papers to prove the land was theirs, no promises from the town, but they had each other and the strength to start again if they must. And for now, the cabin was warm. The earth held steady beneath their feet, and in the corner, a sack of garden seed waited patiently for spring. The first snow came soft, just a dusting across the meadow, enough to mute sound and soften the edges of the world. Tess stood at the window, her hands still from kneading, watching the flakes catch on the roof's edge and melt into dark streaks. Rylan had gone to split the last of the cedar logs stacked near the smokehouse, his boots leaving clean prints through the fresh powder. Juniper's ears twitched where she lay near the hearth, but she didn't rise. The dog had grown leaner, faster since she'd come, her gait steady now and her eyes always following Tess with calm attention. Tess turned back to the bread and pressed her palms into the dough with a kind of practiced care. She no longer flinched at the creak of the door or the wind against the shutters. Her body had relearned steadiness, and her voice had found a way to carry without trembling. When Rylan came in, brushing snow from his shoulders, she didn't look up right away. "You'll want to dry those mitts," she said. "The seams'll pull if they stay too wet." He stepped beside her, laying the mitts near the stove. "I saw tracks by the west fence. Looked like mule deer." She wiped flour from her cheek with the back of her wrist. "Could be they're moving early this year. Might be leaner pickings further north." He nodded. "Wouldn't be the first tight winter." She glanced at him then, her gaze lingering. "We'll be ready." That evening, Rylan brought in a bundle of ash branches and set them near the hearth. Tess was bent over her sewing basket, sorting buttons into neat rows. She looked up as he knelt beside her. "You remember that man from the foothills?" he asked, reaching for a spare length of twine. The one with the cattle news, same. He rode through again. Said the claims office up in Sheridan is opening early this year. Folks been filing ahead of the thaw. She stilled. You thinking of filing? I am. She turned a button in her fingers. And where? He unrolled a scrap of paper from his coat. A hand-drawn map, corners worn soft. There's a bend near the Tongue River east of the timberline. Good grazing. Close enough to town for trade, but quiet. She studied the lines. You think we'd be happier there? I think it's ours if we want it. She folded the map slowly, then set it on the table. When do you ride? End of the week. Be gone 4 or 5 days. Tess nodded once. I'll keep the stove hot, and the dog fed. He touched her chin, tilting her face toward his. You all right with this? She leaned into his palm. I want land that's ours by name. I want to look at a field and know no one can take it. He kissed her, and this time it wasn't gentle. It was full of promise of years to come. When the day came for him to ride, Tess packed food in a linen sack. Cured meat, oat cakes, a jar of pickled onions. She handed it to him with both hands and a nod, no tears, no faltering. He looked down at her. I'll be back before the next snowfall. I'll have your coat mended by then. He touched her cheek, then mounted and rode out with the cold wind tugging at his coat. The days passed quiet. Tess kept her hands busy, mending seams, tightening the coop fencing, stringing herbs to dry near the window. At night, she read aloud to Juniper from the small volume of Whitman Rylan kept by the bed. The dog didn't understand the words, but she stayed pressed close, her breathing slow and even. 3 days in, a storm rolled down from the bighorns, heavy and wet. Tess stoked the fire high, wrapped herself in the second quilt, and waited. On the 5th day, she heard hooves crunching through the snow and stepped out into the dusk just as Rylan rode into the clearing, hat low against the wind. She ran to him without thinking, skirts brushing snow, arms wrapping around his waist before he'd even dismounted. He cupped the back of her head. I filed it, signed and sealed. It's ours. She looked up. All of it, every acre. We'll start moving come spring. That night they slept tangled under the quilts, the map spread on the table, the fire crackling low. Weeks passed. The snow deepened. They dug paths between the coop and the shed, gathered water in buckets, and marked the days with notches on the mantel. Tess began cutting patterns for new curtains, soft indigo cotton saved from a peddler's bolt. Rylan carved a cradle from pine, smoothing the edges with beeswax and cloth. One evening, as the sky faded to slate, Tess stood at the stove stirring a pot thick with beans and smoked meat. Rylan came in from the cold, cheeks ruddy, arms full of firewood. I thought we could use more storage boxes, he said, setting the pile down. She turned, one hand resting on her belly. We'll need them. He crossed the room in 2 strides and laid his palm over hers. You're sure? She nodded. 3 months now, his brow furrowed, eyes shining. You weren't certain before. I wanted to be steady first, for the both of us. He bent his head, kissed her hand. You're more than steady. You're the strongest thing I know. They didn't talk about names yet, or how the cabin would change. They didn't need to. The cradle waited in the corner and the land waited beyond the trees. By March, the snow began to melt in earnest. The river ran faster, bold with thaw. They packed slowly with care, only what they needed. The rest was left for the next soul who might find shelter in the place where Tess had once learned how to breathe again. The journey to the new land took 4 days. The trail was narrow in places, muddy in others, but the wagon held. Juniper ran ahead, barking at birds and sniffing fresh trails. When they reached the flat near the river, Tess climbed down and stood in the open field, her coat pulled tight. The wind lifted her hair, and the earth smelled rich beneath the melting snow. We'll build here, Rylan said, pointing to the rise near the cottonwoods. high enough for spring floods. Close enough to water, she turned to him. We'll grow here. He stepped behind her, arms wrapping around her waist. We already are. They built the new cabin with their own hands, using timber from the nearby grove, stone from the creek bed. It took weeks, but they did not rush. Each wall raised was a promise. Each nail driven was a root sinking deeper. By the time the child came a girl with dark hair and strong lungs, the garden was already sprouting green. The coop held 4 hens, and the cradle rocked gently beside the bed. Tess held their daughter in the crook of her arm and looked out the window at the land they now called home. Rylan came to stand beside her, brushing his fingers gently over the baby's cheek. "She'll never sleep in a stable," he said. "No," Tess whispered. "She'll never have to wonder if she's wanted." He kissed her temple, then her mouth, and the baby stirred between them, sighing into sleep. Outside, the cottonwoods swayed in the breeze and the fields stretched wide and open, ready for planting. Inside, the fire burned low, and between the 3 of them there was nothing missing. Not safety, not love, not a single thing.